So today we're going to be taking on the challenge of deciding the greatest Premier League five-a-side team of all time. I think it's important to start with the goalkeepers. I'm throwing out Schmeichel straight away. Argue with me.
I disagree.
You disagree?
I do. I think shot stopping is very important, but I think tight pitch, five-a-side, you've got to have a keeper that's good with his feet, and that's why I'm going with Ederson.
He's a good shout. I think, if you're going by technical ability, it's good. But for me, Schmeichel was the greatest.
I think 11-a-side, you have a point. I've taken the question very literally. Five-a-side, they've got to be good with their feet. They've got to be able to play out. They've got to be a good shot stopper. For me, Ederson is a good shot stopper, but he's also the best ball-playing goalkeeper in the history of the Premier League, in my opinion. So, in a small goal on a tight pitch, I think he's the most effective five-a-side-wise.
For me, it is Schmeichel. I think 5 Premier League titles. He's got the most of any goalkeeper. Champions League as well, treble-winning side. And then on top of that was part of that Danish side that won the European Championships after only qualifying through Yugoslavia's disqualification. So a phenomenal feat for a sort of small side that shouldn't have even been there. So, yeah, I think just for that pure dominance in the late 90s for him, for me, makes him the greatest Premier League goalkeeper.
Well, unfortunately, I think it's looking like Schmeichel. I couldn't let this go on without having Schmeichel in goal. So 2-1 wins on that one, Joe, I'm afraid. Let's look at defenders then. So that one defender spot for me is JT. It's John Terry, best Premier League defender in my opinion, and brilliant, both-footed, great range of passing, underrated, massively underrated technical ability. So. Yeah, for me, it's Terry.
Well, for me, I think it's incredibly tight, but I think you have to at least consider Vidic. Same amount of Premier League titles as Terry, both got 5. But when it comes to stats, you have to sort of question his clean sheet percentage was 45%. Terry's only 43%. He won 70% of games, whereas Terry only won 63% of games. And okay, Terry played far more games, but you have to sort of question, without Vidic's injuries, and he played maybe more, would this be sort of no debate? But because Vidic had those little periods out, does that just hinder him slightly? Again, he's also a player that won Premier League Best Player twice, the only defender who's done that. And the only other 2 players that have done that was Cristiano Ronaldo and Thierry Henry. So, I mean, Terry's never won that. Yet you've seen Van Dijk and company win it. So for me, I think you have to at least consider Vidic. I think the only area where Terry sort of comes into his own a bit more is perhaps goals and maybe a bit more of that leadership style.
If you're taking it in the way that Joe had mentioned as well, on a five-a-side pitch, you want someone who's technically capable. And I think Terry sort of ticks all those boxes. Okay, he might not have the same personal accolades, but he's made it into World 11s. He's, as you say, he's won the same amount as Vidic has. So it's tough. I think Premier League longevity as well. I think it's important to talk about that. He obviously spent more time in the Premier League than Vidic did at a top level. So, I'll be interested to see what you think on this, Joe.
Again, this is, I think, where my different interpretation of the question is going to be interesting, because I've gone with Ashley Cole. I think a very strong argument for the best fullback in the history of the Premier League. I think it's difficult to find any fullback who's as good in both directions as Cole is. Obviously, I think Alexander-Arnold better going forward, potentially Dennis Irwin better at defending. But in terms of a combination of the two, especially in a five-a-side setting, good in both directions, fast, athletic, nasty, physical, probably had the best battles that Ronaldo has ever come up against consistently in terms of a player who's given him a problem. And I think in that tight setting with changes of direction, with changes in speed, with technical ability, I think you can't really look past Ashley Cole as a 1v1 defender who's going to win you a five-a-side match. I think he's probably the best choice.
The only thing I'd say with that is, excellent defender and was brilliant down that wing. But in a five-a-side pitch, if we're saying he's going to be your last man, he's open in the middle. Do you want that centre-back there that can see the game a little bit more differently, bit more physical, bit stronger if we're coming up against big, quick strikers? Is he going to struggle if he's now got to spread himself where those centre-backs are known in sort of coming up against those 2v1 situations.
Yeah, for me, it's got to be a centre-half there. You want a centre-half, and I think for me, Terry sort of ticks those boxes. Yes, he lacks the pace that Ashley Cole would have massively, but I would have him ahead of Vidic. I think Terry's sort of that middle ground where you've got Vidic is maybe more suited to an 11-a-side, whereas Ashley Cole's probably better at a 5-a-side out of the three. I think Terry sort of fills that middle ground for me.
Well, seeing the way you two have interpreted the question, I, in terms of arguments for the best defender in the history of the Premier League, if you're talking 11-a-side, I would always go with John Terry for me, in terms of stats, in terms of the way he played the game, in terms of influence on his teams. I think he's the best. So I would be more inclined to lean towards Terry than towards Vidic.
Yeah, I think there's very little in it. I think it is extremely tight, and given they both got the sort of similar number of titles, and I think what Vidic achieved in that short period is phenomenal. And perhaps if he'd played a longer period of his career in the Premier League, then perhaps it's a different debate. But given that Terry was at the top for a very long period, I'd be happy to concede him, and he's an excellent defender. I think on a 5-a-side pitch would still be very well suited to that dimension of football.
Yeah, well, let's say Terry then. I think you're right. Vidic with if he had a little bit more longevity, he'd have a shout. But yeah, let's stick Terry in at centre half then. So on to midfielders now. I would have thought going into this that we could have all agreed on this player, but Ronaldo has to be in there.
100%. He was literally the first name I wrote down on my sheet. Attacking. He actually, in a couple of his final seasons at Man U, tracked back as well. So, he's got that work rate, but also explosiveness, change of direction, and just overall athleticism and dribbling ability better than anyone in Premier League history, as well as adding prolific goal scoring. So 5-a-side setting, I think he's more dominant than anyone.
I think that period highlighted his trickery that a lot of people have actually forgotten about. He was this blisteringly quick, dynamic winger that then, as you say, added goals to his game and became sort of a threat in the air and with both feet. And so, yeah, I think on that 5-a-side pitch, he certainly suits the range of football that you have to have.
So that's it then. Cristiano's going in, no doubt. So I think we're going to play another midfielder. I think that's what we'd agreed on. So I'll kick it off again with Frank Lampard. One of the best passers of the ball the Premier League's ever seen. I think he might not have the sort of tiki-taka ability of a David Silva or an Ozil. And I think someone like Steven Gerrard is known more for that long range of pass, even like a Scholes. But I think Lampard had both for me. And I mean, you cannot ignore that goal scoring record. The guy was outstanding season after season. You talk about longevity. For me, he ticks all the boxes.
I'm so glad you said that, because I am fully on board, especially in the dimensions of a 5-a-side pitch. I mean, that was his bread and butter. Arrive late to the edge of a box and find the corner. I mean, if you look at a compilation of Lampard's goals, very few of them are top bins bangers. There are so many that are slotted in the bottom corners, that are clever finishes, that are dinked finishes. So I think versatility and goal scoring, and I think you're right. I think his assists go very under noticed or underrated because of how prolific his goal scoring was. That's the big thing that sticks out. But actually, huge production in terms of assists and being on the ball as well. Maybe lacks the dribbling ability of the Ronaldo, but I think that's where he adds the aspect to our side. So in terms of banging goals and winning you a 5-a-side match, you can't look past Frank Lampard.
Amir, what about you? What are you saying?
So again, I think I'd gone with more sort of throughout the Premier League. I did look at the Scholes, Gerrard, Lampard, and I think as phenomenal as Gerrard was, how can we put him in with no Premier League titles, unfortunately?
Yeah.
He does have a great return, 120 goals and 504 appearances. So it's still a good amount of goals for a midfielder, especially one that dropped deeper. Lampard is definitely up there. 609 games, 177 goals, 3 Premier Leagues. But with Scholes, I mean, Man United have won 13 Premier League titles, and he's won 11 of those, 11 Premier League titles. And again, someone that you'd always think about as a slightly more reserved midfielder. 499 games, 107 goals. He's not even that far off the other two in terms of goal scoring, yet always typically played a slightly more defensive role, especially as he moved on with his career. So I think if we're going with that five-a-side and we've got to pick a slightly more defensive player to just shore up that back alongside your defensive player, I think given we've got Ronaldo pushing on, you don't need Lampard's goals so much. I think it's more about providing a little bit more of assurances at the back. So for me, it has to be Scholes, who Henri said he thought was the greatest Premier League player.
Yeah, I mean, what an argument! Scholes technically, again, absolutely brilliant, and I think you've made a great point. If you're trying to look at this, taking a lot of factors in, taking in the five-a-side element and taking in their stats and their Premier League performance, Scholes really does tick that box. I mean, yeah, maybe Lampard's forward runs would leave us a little open. You might want Scholes capable of sitting back a little bit. I mean, look, think of the other players we're missing, though. Look, Roy Keane, even someone like a David Silva or Yaya Toure. Imagine Yaya Toure in a five-a-side pitch.
Yeah, for me, I think the argument in terms of Scholes being more defensive than Lampard is true. I would agree with that. I would, however, put up the counter argument that Chelsea's most successful sides in the Premier League era, like 9, 10, and the 04 to 06 period, both employed like a counter pressing in terms of when we lost the ball, went to press and immediately regained possession. And Lampard is overall weaker defensively than I would say Scholes. But in terms of a five-a-side, lose the ball, press, win the ball back as quick as you can, he was a big part of our tactics in that era. So I think in a five-a-side setting, he wouldn't be as weak defensively as you would imagine. Plus, for me, despite the closeness in terms of production, he is still way ahead in goal scoring.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's so tough. I mean, you've got to look at Lampard's goal scoring, but I feel like I've been persuaded to go with Scholes here, you know. I'm looking at that balance of the team and I'm looking down on my team sheet and I think Scholes and Ronaldo in that midfield, I think that would take some beating. It really would.
I think one other is to quickly consider is Giggs. I mean, he's won 13 Premier League titles. That is ridiculous. I mean, when you actually think about that, he's won every Premier League title that Man U have won. The next closest team is Chelsea with 5. And it's just phenomenal that one player has maintained that ability. And I think if we didn't have Ronaldo, then there'd certainly be a case for him. But I think given his sort of the lack of defensive abilities, I think we can't quite fit him in. He'd need to be alongside another similar player. So for me, it has to be Scholes. He brings that balance to the side. And as much as I love Lampard's brilliance, I think he was slightly more known for his entering the box at the end. And we don't need that third player in the attack on five-a-side. I think those front two are going to be doing the bulk of that work.
Yeah, I think I'm happy to take Scholes. I mean, the thing is, Scholes was played as a second striker at times for Man United. I'm pretty sure he started the 99 FA Cup final as a second striker. So, you know, he's hardly bad playing in that position. And if you're taking these players at their prime, I think I'm happy to go with Scholes. I think I've been persuaded.
I won't be persuaded. I'm sticking with Lampard, despite the fact that you two have outvoted me. I'm not changing. Lampard's going in my team.
Well, he might be in yours, but he's not in ours. So Scholes goes in, I'm afraid. Right, up top now. Let's head to Joe. What are you saying, Joe?
Another one that I think is potentially controversial, but I've gone with Luis Suarez. Variations in finishes, aggression, pressing, plays in tight areas. You can see from, I know he isn't in the Prem, but his time at Barcelona, he's happy to play in tight areas, quick one-touch passing. Like I said, the variation in the goals he scored, his ability to finish from multiple different angles and positions, as well as just being a horrible person to play against. I think five-a-side, there's always that nasty guy who's going around kicking people. I think he'd be happy to be that person, as well as banging 20 goals every 5 minutes.
It's hard to argue against. Suarez isn't one that comes to mind for me, but he was phenomenal in the time that he played it. Again, I don't know if he had that longevity for me. No Premier League title, It's a tough one. It is a tough one. I mean, Emir, what do you think?
It's difficult. I think this one, it at first seemed really obvious that for me it had to be Thierry Henry. He had to be there. Only 2 Premier League titles, but a phenomenal goal scoring record in that time. 174 goals in 258 games. That's 0.68 goals per game. The only person that's got a better goal per game ratio is Aguero. So that all of a sudden sort of changed my view of it. Shearer, again, phenomenal goal record, but was in the Premier League his whole career. So I think for me, there's not quite that same level there. And again, a lot of his goals were headers that in a 5-a-side pitch I don't think quite work. For me, it has to be Henry, given the feet, the dribbling, the finishing, the turning of defenders. I think for 5-a-side, he's the one you want. He's physical and can go up against those tough defenders, but still has the technique to just run rings around players.
We got to talk more about Alan Shearer, though. Surely he's the first one that come to mind for me. 260 Premier League goals. It's unrivaled. And yes, I get that he was there for a long time, but I would look at it as that he was there for a long time. Longevity in the Premier League is something for me I respect so highly. And yes, he was an English player, unlikely to leave, but I can guarantee he had opportunities. He didn't. He stayed. And to score the goals that he did with a Newcastle team who, for a lot of his career, were not at the top, I think is just outstanding. I think it's a good point about on a 5-a-side pitch, you'd look at him as maybe not being as of such a good quality, but I'm not sure. I think you got to consider Shearer.
For me, when I was coming down to mine, I started with a list of quite a few strikers. There was a Torres in there. There was a Drogba in there. When I got literal with the question of who would I want in a 5-a-side team or who would I not want to play against, it came down to a battle of two with Henry and Suarez. I see your argument, Tom, but I do think Amir makes a very good point that his strengths don't suit a tight area where you've got to come up with quick finishes from unorthodox angles. You're not just getting onto the end of a cross. You're not being able to dominate someone in the air. I don't by any means think he would be ineffective. I think Henry and Suarez would be more effective. And to be honest, this one, I'm willing to be convinced here that Henry would be better than Suarez because, obviously, of that longevity. He has won Premier League titles. And I think between those two, it's a coin flip. So I'd be happy to sway the way of Henry. But I don't think you're going to convince me that in a 5-a-side setting, Shearer is going to be the most effective Premier League striker.
Can we talk about Bergkamp here, though? Imagine Bergkamp on a 5-a-side pitch, not your top goal scorer, but imagine the link-up play with Scholes and Ronaldo. The goals that they would score.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. He certainly sort of reinvented that role in terms of finesse and taking that striker role in a different way in terms of trying to bring others into the game. But I think if he's up top, you want him scoring the goals. You don't want him necessarily trying to bring those others in. If he gets that one-on-one, I fancy Henry or even Suarez ahead of him. I think he was brilliant at bringing that midfield to the strikers and slotting those players like Henry in. So I think if we're going for a striker, an out-and-out striker, it has to be someone that's a proven goal scorer and not a little bit more nuanced in their style.
Yeah, Bergkamp for me is a player that before my time in terms of interest in the Premier League, I didn't watch a whole lot of him. But when I've gone back and watched old Premier League games, he's the guy who's really captured my imagination. He was a gorgeous player to watch. But I think in this 5-a-side setting, I think he's almost fighting with Ronaldo and Scholes over that position. He's not the man up top banging the goals in. He is more of a provider that chips in with goals as well. So I think if there might be an argument for me, if you were to say maybe swap Ronaldo, maybe swap Scholes, I don't think he wins in either of those positions either, to be honest. But up top, I don't think you can look past Henry or Suarez. And I think, to be honest, I'm leaning towards Henry now. Now he's made a very strong argument for him.
Right, so we've got our 5-a-side team. Let's look back. In goal, we have got big Peter Schmeichel. Centre half, John Terry. We got a midfield 2 of Ronaldo and Scholes sitting just behind. And then the man himself, Thierry Henry, up front. It's a fantastic team, guys. I'm glad to have had this discussion. And yeah, we'll catch you next time.